Hi everyone, I'm back in New Zealand at the moment and look what I found in my parents' house, all with my name on the inside and even when I bought them. So I was given the whole series of Mr. Bean books over the years, by my grandmother I think. Anyway, this one, Mr. Silly, made me think about creativity. So I'm wondering if, as we're reading the story, we could think whether it might inspire some creativity in us in any way. Mr. Silly. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as can be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are red and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, not forward, they fly backwards. It really is a very silly place indeed, which of course is why Mr. Silly lives there. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives in quite the silliest looking house you've ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier looking house than this? I think it would just collapse. Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land each year they hold a competition, and the cup is the award awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night lying in bed, he dreamed about winning it. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realized that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. Well, he was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. After that, he had a cornflake sandwich, and to finish, he had a boiled egg. But being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking how to win that cup. He remembered 2 years ago the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won it by wallpapering his house, which sounds very ordinary, but in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of his house. And Mr. Silly remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who was a friend of Mr. Silly's, had won the cup by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, apart from one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? I think that you could think of a better way to create a ridiculous car. Mr. Silly thought and thought about it, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. Very silly. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots. In New Zealand we call these gumboots. And an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella? He said to the chicken. Meow, said the chicken, because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. On his walk, Mr. Silly also met a worm wearing a top hat, a monocle, and an old school tie. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear a top hat, a monocle, and an old school tie? He said to the worm. Quack, 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 said the worm. And on his walk, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing sunglasses and smoking a cigar. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear sunglasses and smoked a cigar? He said to the pig. Moo, said the pig. It was in the middle of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea, quite the silliest idea he ever had. He hurried into town and bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. The day of the great award of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The king of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to the crowd in the city square, it is my pleasure today to award the Nonsense Cup to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. One of the silliest ideas of the year, continued the king, is by Mr. Muddle the farmer. He has managed to grow, of all things, a square apple. The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everyone to see. He felt sure he was going to win. However, said the king, and Mr. Muddle's face fell, we have an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop. It was a teapot, quite the silliest teapot there'd ever been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. I therefore have great pleasure, announced the king, in presenting the nonsense cup to... Just then he looked up and stopped in astonishment. Now in the middle of the city square, there is a tree. It's always been there, and it was at this tree that the king was looking in astonishment. What, he cried, has happened to that tree? Everyone turned to look, and the tree had green leaves, bright green leaves. Not red leaves like all the trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was an amazed silence. It was me, piped up Mr. Silly. I painted all the leaves last night. I painted them green when you were asleep. A green tree, exclaimed the king. Who ever heard of a green tree? A green tree, shouted the crowd. How silly! And they started to applaud. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. I think, he said, that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of, and therefore I award the nonsense cup to Mr. Silly. The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. And a bird, perched high up in the branches of the green silly tree, looked down. Woof, it said as it flew backwards. Now, my favourite part of this story is the way it's actually ended. It's ended on a punchline, a silly punchline. It just didn't end with Mr. Silly winning his cup. It ended with something funny, which was the bird saying woof and flying backwards. Personally, I don't think this book, despite it being part of the Mr. Men series and the author being so famous, is actually as silly as it could be. I wonder if we could use our imagination and use this book as inspiration to create a much sillier story, maybe even some very silly artwork.